Welcome to Grounded Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won real-world experiences. Experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's guest is Ed Seidel. Ed Seidel is the president of the University of Wyoming. As a computational physicist, President Seidel is also one of the most highly cited members of the University of Wyoming's faculty. This is rare among modern university presidents. He has led large research groups and worked in university administrations in many different parts of the United States, including Illinois and Louisiana, and also in other countries, including Germany and Russia. He started his presidency here at the University of Wyoming on July 1st, 2020. His 5-year tenure here has therefore spanned one of the most challenging and interesting times in the history of higher education in the United States. We discuss his career, the challenges he has helped the University of Wyoming navigate, and what he sees as the most important impacts that university leaders can have on their campuses. President Seidel, welcome to Grounded Not Divided.
Nice to be here.
Before we start, I just want to say I really appreciate the accessibility and transparency that you're showing here and that you've shown, I think, on a lot of different issues, certainly over the last few months that I've been here. It's a refreshing difference, I think, from 99% of college presidents. So I appreciate it and proud to be here.
Thank you.
So I want to start a little bit with about you. So where did you grow up? Kind of what's the 1 to 2 minute summary of how you got into academia?
Well, my dad was a college professor. At least I knew him as a college professor. He'd actually had a 20-year career in the Navy during the war, World War II, that is. And he started a family after he retired, and then he got his PhD and became a college professor. And for whatever reasons, he was like an itinerant college professor. So he taught at different places, from Florida State to North Carolina State to California State College in Pennsylvania, Western Connecticut State College, and I lived in almost every state between Florida and Connecticut growing up. And I would say my what I think of as my home is really Newtown, Connecticut, which is where I went to high school. But I just kind of had an education in my family. My mom was also a teacher, and first in her family to go to college, by the way. And so that kind of all feeds into what I think about higher education and what's good about it and how it can be better.
And so starting from a very concrete upbringing to an area that many people would find very abstract, how did you get interested in computational physics?
Yeah, well, I could go on for this could take the whole program, but I'll try to be kind of brief, but because it's something that I'm extremely passionate about. But I'll start off by saying I didn't ever mean to get into computational physics, but I did really love science as a kid, and I was really inspired growing up in the '60s with the space program and TV shows. Lost in Space was one; it's kind of almost forgotten now, but Star Trek, of course, continues on to this day, and that influenced me tremendously in keeping my interest in the world and the universe and science in particular. And so I did that, and I was inspired by it. And we don't have time to go into it too much, but I stumbled a lot in college in my early days. But science is one of the things that kind of kept me going. And I eventually really wanted to do my PhD in general relativity and astrophysics. And so I did that. And I even have a funny story about how I tried to avoid computing. I started and did a project for a summer and part of a year in high energy physics. And I remember thinking to myself, I really want to do physics. So I don't want to sit in front of a computer screen for the rest of my life. And this was early on when computers were not that widely used. So I tried to do something safer, which was general relativity and black holes. But it turns out you can't solve the equations of general relativity without supercomputers if you really want to solve them in detail. So I was inexorably drawn into it. And I've just had a great deal of fun and a great career doing that. And I so do love that. And I ended up going from that into leading some research groups in a number of places, including University of Illinois. And ultimately, I was recruited to lead a big research group at the Max Planck Institute for Gravitational Physics in Berlin, Germany. And that was extremely important in my development, both for science and for the work I did in computing, because over time I got more and more engaged on the computing side because you just needed to use these computers. And we had problems that were so demanding that we got into research into the computer science of it in order to solve our physics problems. And so I ended up in two places in particular that formed my thinking about really in many ways the future of higher education around the science and technology side, which is you needed larger and larger teams of people that have different kinds of expertise. And in this case, it might be mathematics, applied mathematics, computer science, parallel computing, scientific visualization, general relativity, some astrophysics as well. If you want to solve like a quote real problem in astrophysics, like what happens when two black holes collide. And so that just continued on, and I ended up going into areas that I had never expected. I ended up working with companies, even though I was still studying black holes. I ended up working at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications and eventually became the director of that at the University of Illinois. And I went to the National Science Foundation. I oversaw all the programs in mathematical and physical sciences, as well as supercomputing and computational science generally. So it's a long way from black holes, but you got a sense like how that all happened, and that became a really important part of who I am.
Yeah, my father is a high energy theoretical cosmologist, and so we certainly could do a whole episode on physics if we wanted to. Really, really fascinating field. And one of the things that our listeners may not know is, in addition to being unusually transparent, we are, I think, one of the only universities whose president is also one of the most cited faculty members on the faculty, which is really cool. So you talked about how the area of physics you're in is a big team science area that naturally took you into leading large research groups. Is that what got you into administration? And at what point did you decide that administration was something that you wanted to pursue as a career?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I almost kind of backed into it without realizing it, and how that happened was I ended up being successful at bringing together some large collaborations, as I kind of hinted at, and that ended up bringing in the need for more and more grant funding. So I was writing grants and ended up in a couple of projects in Europe that each involved more than 10 countries. And so, and I led one of them, and I was kind of like among the leaders in another one of them. And so, what I realized before long was that my research groups were so large that I was largely doing administration, and I realized it was necessary. And you still are at least a figurehead, but if not actually driving the directions of the science, but you're not necessarily doing it yourself directly. And so that got me to the point where I had dozens of people in my research group, and I had these collaborations with multiple universities in different countries and so on. So I ended up being recruited at one point to lead a center, a brand new center in Louisiana that the governor had started in 2020, a program called Vision 2020 for the state of Louisiana. And it was in 2000. I mean, it started in the year 2000, so a 20-year look ahead. And they invested $25 million annually into a new sort of statewide program, and LSU was going to be the centerpiece of it. And it convinced me to move from Berlin to build, doing, in a physics institute, to come to build this sort of much bigger impact kind of center at LSU that involved other research universities in the state, all the state universities, as well as Tulane. And we worked together, and it was pretty exciting. And I realized I can have real impact at a new level, at a sort of administration level. And eventually, that took me on to the National Science Foundation to become the head of those programs that I mentioned before. And so, once you're there, it's sort of a natural thing for people to look at you as a candidate for a vice president for research or university president or something like that. And I kept honing my skills until I felt like I was ready to do more.
So you've been all over the country so far, I think. even technically Baton Rouge, Louisiana, is east of the Mississippi. uh, Barely, right? Uh, and then the job came up to be the president of the University of Wyoming. What made you decide to take the plunge here, and what did you want to accomplish coming in? And we'll get to how you started in July 2020, and so I'm sure there was lots of revision to plans with the pandemic and everything. But what attracted you to the job here, and what did you hope to accomplish?
Well, yeah, those various stops along the way, a couple times being a vice president for research or for economic development at Illinois and in other places. In Russia, I left that part out. I'd worked in Russia for almost 2 years to help build a brand new university, by the way, in collaboration with MIT. It was a very exciting project that taught me a lot about what could be. And maybe I'll just take a second to digress on that because in this case, the Russian Federation decided they needed to have more innovation out of their universities that impacted their economy and so on. And Medvedev came to Washington in 2010 to visit with President Obama and asked, "How do you get so much innovation out of your universities?" And it led to a visit by Medvedev to both MIT and Stanford. And that led to a contract with MIT to give them $300 million to help them build a brand new university that could be as good as MIT, in a very short period of time. And I felt like the lucky guy to be selected to help be the senior vice president for research and innovation of that university. And I learned so much from that experience, both culturally as well as kind of what could be in a university. So I had these kind of ideas in my mind about where could you take a university if you had an opportunity to do it. And so then I came back. Turned out, as I like to say, that project was exciting, but it looks better in PowerPoint than in real life sometimes. It was complicated because it didn't come into power, and you could see the thing going in a different direction. So then I was at Illinois, and there I ultimately became the VP for economic development. And so I talked a lot and worked a lot with the governor and the state legislature in order to build those kind of skills that are needed in our students in order to help drive the economy. So whether you're an English major or an engineering major, think about how do you add on the skills that are needed, and I'll come back to this later, that are needed to really help drive the economy. So I had these things in my mind, but I love the West. I never had a chance to live in the mountains in the West, and I uh, grew up watching westerns and such things. And when the job opened up at the University of Wyoming, I just thought that for me that was a great opportunity. And I came and I interviewed, and fortunately for me, at least, I got the job. I felt I was ready. Um, I love the culture of Wyoming. And it's something that I'm not from Wyoming, but I do feel that I identify so much with the way people work here. And it's interesting with these ideas, the priorities I had were kind of they were very high, lofty ideals. I think for what I saw in my career at many places, and there were three of them, and I want to read them out here because they're important. So the first one was I could see the incredible transformation of not only science, but much more broadly society due to the revolution of computing and digital techniques. And you're seeing that, even more and more now than I was thinking about it when I came here with the kind of emergence of AI, at least in the public eye. Second thing, and I mentioned this earlier about the need to bring together different areas of expertise to address real world problems. And so a university's got it. They've got everything from social sciences through engineering, especially like the University of Wyoming. That's both a land grant and a flagship university. So we have it all. So what a great opportunity to say, if there's a problem that Wyoming has, whether it's economic development or enhancing energy extraction and you name any of these things, entrepreneurship, we can throw the whole university at the problem. So the need to bring teams together for complex challenges. And the third one was can a university really be an innovation engine for the economy to drive the economy, just as Russia wanted to do, just as many land grants across the United States are trying to do? So I wanted to bring all of these together, and I had an opportunity to do it here, and I could see how important it was. Now, the thing is, you have to take all those ideas and figure out how to apply it to the local culture. And it turned out it's just very different from any place I lived. I thought I had a lot of experiences in different places, and and I'll be able to take them here. And you just almost have to start over again in such a new culture here. So I've worked hard to figure out how to make sure that we build this. And the thing that I've really moved to from those, I haven't given up on those three things. I even called them the three pillars when I first got here, or three of four pillars, but was student success and enrollment. Of course, that's built in there, but I've kind of flipped it now. So I put that first, and those other things help drive that. But such things are really important. Fundraising, financial diversification, and the sense of strong shared governance that you need in a university. So I've worked hard to kind of keep to my bearings on those high level things, but to build these other things in. And at the University of Wyoming, it's still a work in progress, but I think we're moving it.
Yeah, and it's basically impossible to overstate how unusual a time it was in higher ed when you started as our president. Although I wasn't here yet, but you started on July 1st, 2020. So just to orient folks who don't remember, that means we were at the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was barely a month after George Floyd was killed, which sparked a huge wave of unrest in cities and on campuses across the country. I was in CU Boulder at the time, and I remember, the faculty, and I remember on the one hand, we were facing a potential budget crisis. There was a hiring freeze. We were trying to figure out how are we going to teach in the fall safely? How are we going to fund the safety measures that we needed to add to things like ventilation and space? And then we also had, students in our department and elsewhere on campus making demands for town halls, for public statements from faculty administrators, for new, race-based hiring programs and courses, DEI trainings, and other sorts of things. And there were people in the community, regardless of where you stood on the specific campus issues, everybody was generally horrified by what had happened in Minneapolis, and then also, in Colorado, in Aurora, with the Elijah McClain case. I'm not sure if the news of that got up here, but it was a wild summer to be a university administrator. I'm sure, particularly a brand new one. How did you experience that period, and how did it affect your first year on campus and your priorities?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I'll try to take it each piece of it. It was very difficult. I won't hide that it was really difficult. And there's a kind of a club of university presidents who had the bad luck to start on July 1st of 2020, like a number of us did, and we kind of know each other, and we kind of held hands and said, okay, we're going to get through this together. So I would call people up and get some advice, but they're like, wow. And I'll tell you, it came with such swiftness. I was interviewed in February of 2020, and
Right,
there was not a single question on what would you do with a global pandemic? What would you do with potentially $50 million in budget cuts? And what about all the social unrest that's about to explode? How are you going to handle that all at the
right,
same time? And so I got here, um, having been in little Champaign, Urbana, and even there in Illinois, and in this little, well, actually by Wyoming standards, it's a fairly large town, but by Chicago standards, it's a little tiny town, and it we had some riots in the town actually due to the social unrest, and I was thinking a lot about that. I As the semester went on after it had been selected in March but didn't start till July 1st, my office happened to oversee the development of the PCR testing. I forget even what that stands for in terms of the technical language, but it's about the saliva based test that where they do the test to see if there's virus there, and and so I knew about that, and I knew about the plans we put in place, and so I got here, and on day one, I found the plans for that were not really there. That the social unrest had really grown a lot, and it was quite disturbing to a lot of people across the country. And of course, then there were budget cuts that I hadn't anticipated. So I can tell you a little bit about how I dealt with each of those. But let me start with the issues around George Floyd and social unrest. So the riots, even in Champaign, impacted me a lot, and I had an email from somebody who reported to me at the University of Illinois after all those issues had taken place. I mean, during the first week, it was just really a tumultuous event that just all happened across the whole country, and there were riots literally across the country. And she wrote to me and she said, I'm very disappointed that none of you asked me if I'm okay in all of this. It was an African American woman. And it really impacted me. And it impacted me so much that I actually wrote a kind of a message to the campus at the University of Wyoming at that time. As just an incoming, but not yet here president, not really understanding the local culture. But I tried to frame it in not like a social revolution kind of way or anything like that, but just to say people are hurting no matter where you're from politically. You just need to just sort of ask people if they're doing okay and reach out to each other. Answer this distress call, is the way I entitled it. And it became, I kind of wrote it, just woke up one morning and I wrote this thing and I sent it off. And our PR people said, it sounds really good. We'll go ahead and put that out. But it kind of framed the way I think about this going forward. I don't, and we'll maybe come to this later, but I don't often like to make comments about social issues as a university president unless you can see it's impacting your campus in a very particular way, and to do it in a neutral way is what is. So that's kind of like maybe the beginning of how I thought about all of that. So um, if I can keep going, I'll tell you about COVID a
Yeah,
little bit.
please do.
So COVID was amazing because um, it first of all, the technology surprised me. Everybody on there was like a day in the middle or end of March when suddenly all classes went online, like all across the country. And I was pretty sure that the IT systems in place were all going to break because there's no one had ever tested this before. So that in itself was interesting that it didn't really break. There had been a lot of resistance by faculty for online courses. I mean, across the country, and in Wyoming, there was no exception there. So you had to then really on the turn just of a dime, you had to immediately go online and figure out how to do that. So that was very difficult. But then the virus and the study of virology and all of the things that needed to happen there, I'd say in the scientific community, not controversial, but among many people, quite controversial. And I found it very challenging. But I when I got here, I felt we have got to increase our ability to handle this virus. So I put in place a lot of testing. Thankfully, we had the vet med lab here. It was by good luck that the vet med lab director had once been at the University of Illinois and knew the people there who were actually pioneering the test. So we borrowed a lot of their technology. We put in all kinds of ways to try to mitigate the spread of the virus. And I don't know really in the end how effective it was, but I think we did a very good job. But at the same time, I had a lot of frustration from people across the state who really didn't believe in all of this. And I remember I got a very angry email and said something like, "This is the worst decision ever for doing what you're doing around the common cold." And so I made a lot of effort to kind of reach out to people and have real discussions with them. And rather than just ignoring them, I got into some dialogues, and it helped me understand the state. And I think it helped them understand, the people I spoke to, that I was serious about this. And then when the vaccines came out, um, I just happened to know through my experience in collaboration with MIT, the head of the Moderna company, at least the founder of it, Bob Langer, who's a professor, like the most cited scientist or engineer, I think,
Uh-huh.
in all of history. He's a superstar. And so I know about the history of how they developed that vaccine, and I had a lot of confidence in it and so on. So when people were very skeptical about it, I was pretty strong about the importance of it. Of course, we wouldn't mandate such things, but just to encourage this as a public health item here. So it was very hard to navigate that, but I'm pretty proud of how the university came out with it. Um, I can go into budget cuts if you want to hear about that.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, because budget cuts, wow, that was another thing. No one asked me about the budget cuts when they interviewed me, and I got here, and there's like, you know what, the governor's proposing a multi-step process for budget cuts, and if you added them all up together, it's $50 million. And so I remember thinking I was taking some pretty bold action to
And
immediately.
sorry, just for our audience
Yeah.
who doesn't know UW very well, what fraction of the budget is that?
Well, that's I think over a 2-year period, if I remember right. I might be forgetting it. So, but it doesn't really matter. It's a very major fraction. Like you couldn't achieve those by shutting down an entire college. So
Gotcha.
it
Yeah.
would just be it's that order of magnitude, and so it was very difficult. And so the first thing I had to do was make sure we lowered our spend rates. And so I worked with my financial team immediately to figure out what we could do without we didn't I did not want to lower salaries, by the way. So people said we'll have to lower salaries, and I did not want to do that. I thought salaries were already low enough, and they were lower than most other universities in my experience. So didn't want to do that. I also knew how important the extension system was to the entire state. So I said, whatever we do, we're not going to cut the extension system. So I didn't want to just do peanut butter. Everybody gets this, 10% cut or something like that, or perhaps even more. But I wanted to be very selective. And so I tried to do everything I could to look for efficiencies, propose reorganizing colleges so that there could be teaching efficiencies, and try to set things up for the future. So I thought, if the state economy has taken such a downturn in terms of available cash that comes from the usual source of revenue for the state that then come back to the university, why is that? So I looked at the markets that are operating in the state. There's agriculture, there's energy, there's tourism and hospitality, and we don't have a program in that. So we need one to help grow that segment of the economy. It has the most employees in the state. So we're going to do that. And I thought entrepreneurship, I was just coming thinking like a VP for economic development. We have to grow the economy. And the two things you need there are entrepreneurship programs across the whole university, not just in the College of Business. And I found that the digital training for our students was not adequate. So proposed a school of computing. And I did this at a time of budget cuts. So you can imagine that was scary to a lot of people.
Right.
But we launched all the processes we needed in order to go through the faculty senate, and had working groups to make proposals and to say how this should come up. And I let them do their work. And we proposed a year later to the board of trustees, and they approved them all. And I know some people are still kind of are not so sure about it, but I feel like we pivoted the university in the face of a crisis like that, and they're all operating now, and I think they're getting traction. And I think I took the long view. How do we dig ourselves out? Not just the band-aid approach, but what's going to help us in the long term. So I really took that view.
And this ties back actually in an interesting way, I think, to trust, which is what I was going to ask you about next, because connecting the university's training to the economy of the state is, improves the value proposition of the university, but also creates, I imagine, closer connections with the state in ways that, align the interests and build trust. Is that been Have you seen that sort of already in your in as you've rolled these things out?
I think it's a long process to gain trust, especially for in Wyoming, for somebody coming in who's never lived in Wyoming. And I must say that that's been a barrier for me. I think one thing people don't know, somebody once told me I should stop wearing cowboy boots, but you know what? I enjoy it. I like the culture here. So there's just been some skepticism, I think, about me coming basically from the East Coast or even further away, in different parts, that there's been that. But I think people are getting the idea that not just I, but the team that we've built, and we really worked hard. I didn't really get into this, but we renewed our team in the first year and a half. I think we hired six new vice presidents and six new deans. There was a lot of transition. Oh yeah, I forgot to say that I was the sixth president in 7 years at the university, so there was just a lot of turnover and that sort of thing. So there'd been a loss of trust in the institution itself for that reason alone. There are much bigger issues across the
Right.
nation, but there were all of these things. So I do feel like we're making progress in gaining trust, but there are also some bigger issues about trust at in terms of higher education you might want to get into. But in
Yeah,
any
so
case,
let's go there. We talked a little bit about politics and unrest in 2020, and and over the past few years, there are a few signs that the public has gotten pretty tired of all the politics on campus, and it started measurably affecting trust in higher education to the point where Gallup had a poll last summer that found that that's now a bigger reason for Americans to mistrust universities than their costs are, which is kind of amazing. Your administration was one of the first in the country to take a new approach called institutional neutrality, which is part of the free expression policy here at UW. Now there are, particularly after October the 7th, there's many other universities that have adopted the same policy. But what is institutional neutrality, and what does that look like at UW today?
Right. Well, institutional neutrality is it's a really important concept, and I spent a lot of time with my teams thinking about how to adopt that. What does it mean for the University of Wyoming, and especially in a time of so much diversity of opinion across the country? And I wouldn't just say diversity of opinion, but the sort of split. And there's a big, quite strong polarization, is really what I'm trying to say. The university's got to be able to sail through that and be a place where it really encourages such viewpoints, and where it could be a place where you can work things out, talk things through, and so on. So if the university itself begins to take strong stands because it happens that the president has certain views, or the administration does, or the faculty, some group of faculty do, that can further erode trust in the institution from that point of view. So we worked hard. Uh, I would say to implement this in a way, but I want to say a little bit about how this really came about. So with all of that discussion going on, and there was a feeling that, in particular, all universities across the country, and Wyoming included, have a liberal mindset. And so I was asked at an advisory committee meeting a couple, maybe almost 3 years ago, by someone named Karen Kemmerer, up from Jackson, about whether I believed in freedom of expression on campus. And it was kind of a provocative question, and Karen and I become quite good friends. But I said, of course. And I happen to have just, by good fortune, worked on principles for the University of Illinois for freedom of expression just a couple years before that. And I'd studied in depth the Chicago principles, which are well known across the country, and they've been one of the pioneering institutions in describing what's needed in order for the institution itself not to take a position, but to really promote diversity of opinion on the campus and promote respectful discourse and so on. So I took that question from Karen to heart. And so then I said, okay, let's create a process to make sure we look ourselves in the mirror. And who are we as an institution? Do we have biases? And what can we do? And I charged a working group that included people from in the campus and across the state, including people like Karen and legislators and others, and people with quite different opinions, very liberal, very conservative people. And they came up with a set of recommendations that responded to my charge, which included, what are our principles as an institution? And around institutional, not I didn't frame it as institutional neutrality, but I did say, what are our principles around freedom of expression and respectful discourse, and how do we operationalize them? So I didn't want this to be a set of platitudes coming out of the president's office. And they came back with a, I don't know, very lengthy report with a set of principles that built on the Wyoming Constitution, the Code of the West, and also, the Calvin Report out of the University of Chicago, and I don't know that's out of Chicago, but the Chicago
It is,
principles,
yeah.
and yeah, and so on. And so I think they came up with something that really fits Wyoming, and I'm really quite proud of it. But then there was a set of ideas about how do you operationalize this, and they were around a number of different areas. What do you actually do on campus? How do you communicate it? How do you make sure that people are trained in it? And so all of these kinds of issues. And rather than just accepting them, we took on a process where we had the faculty senate look at it and critique it. We had the student senate, we had the staff senate, we had the cabinet look at it, and then eventually they all ended up voting to support it, and it took it to the trustees, and then it turned into something that's really not just a document sitting on a shelf, but something we're trying to live by. And now we still have working groups that are looking at how to continue to operationalize this. And we've just hired Martha McCoy for the last couple of years to be special assistant to the president. I mean, for the next couple of years, to be special assistant to the president to continue to operationalize this. Now, it is getting attention across the country. I think people are seeing it. I think the state is beginning to really understand that we may have liberal faculty, we may have some conservative faculty. It's all good. We want to encourage all of that, and we don't want anyone to feel that they are not able to express themselves. That we've worked very hard on doing this, and we're getting this national attention. I have a little anecdote about how that played out. So I was on a panel. I was invited to a panel at the University of Chicago to discuss this at the Heterodox Academy meeting. I know, Matt, you were there. And it seemed to go quite well. But that the fact that I was invited there to the University of Chicago just was a sign that the university is a bit on the move on this. Um, but then I met somebody in Alpine, Wyoming last August, and they said they just dropped their daughter off to start school at Vanderbilt University. And the chancellor came and spoke to them about how they were Vanderbilt is one of the leaders in freedom of expression. There are only 5 universities in the country that are doing this the right way. And he mentioned University of Wyoming. And they came to me and they said, he said the University of Wyoming. Is that really true? Are you doing this? I'm like, yes, I'm proud of it. So it's an ongoing process, but it's something that I think will help bring us attention. It'll help us better educate our students. It'll help us be a better forum for expression, freedom of expression, and being able to get to the real issues around the topics that are vexing the whole nation, and see if we can actually add something to finding out how to solve them.
And recruitment too. I'll just say, throw in an anecdote of my own. So, I was approached just a little over a year ago by the economics department at UW, which is very strong and particularly has a strength in interdisciplinary areas and modeling areas related to the environment. And so, I was very intrigued because very, very strong in my field. And at the same time, I was working with Martha McCoy, who at the time was Heterodox Academy's national director of campus engagement, and I was the co-chair of CU Boulder's Heterodox Academy chapter. And so she started telling me about all the great things that you and others were doing at University of Wyoming. That in many cases were things that I felt like I had been beating my head against the wall nationally to try to get universities to pay attention to and do for years. So just, certainly was something that made coming to the University of Wyoming very attractive to me. Now, shifting gears a little bit, you talked when we were talking about the summer of 2020, you talked about how there were people who, big things that affected the campus were happening in the world. There were people who expected you to react in a certain way. Often there's people who expect you to react in kind of conflicting ways, right? So you talked about how you had an African American colleague who was wanted to know why you weren't asking if they were okay. It reminded me of a conversation I had a few months after that with an African American student at CU who was expressing annoyance that he felt like all the conversations he was having with people were white people asking him if he was okay. uh, so, uh, but the point being that just because UW has decided to have institutional neutrality doesn't mean that controversial things are going to stop happening in the world that affect the campus. So October 7th attacks happened in 2023. There have been concerns about anti-Semitism. There have been concerns about free speech, both related to the Israel-Palestine conflict and other issues in the local community. You talked at Heterodox Academy about a free speech case involving a community member, in our campus. There have been controversies around transgender issues in sports and in Greek life, guns on campus. That's just a few examples from maybe the past 2 years related to UW. So now that we have these principles of free expression and institutional neutrality, when a controversial news cycle comes across your desk that affects somebody or a group of people on campus in a visceral way, what's your approach and thought process?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and there's not a very simple answer to it, but because even though we have these principles like institutional neutrality and a framework, I would say that we've developed for how do we respond, or how might we respond. And I think one of our statements that at least was in a press release that went out when we adopted our principles and so on, was that the institution would rarely, if ever, speak out on such events that happened, but there could be some exceptions. And so we have to think about it. Does this rise a level where there's an exception, whatever that might be? And it did happen that just as we were adopting those, the October 7th attacks occurred in Israel. And I have some familiarity there. I went to Israel a number of times in recent years, and I felt like I knew people there very well. And I was quite reluctant to issue any kind of a statement on it. But I began to hear more and more from our local communities. People had family members there, some in Gaza, some in Israel. We had faculty members actually in Israel when that occurred, and we actually had to send get a charter plane to get them out because flights had been canceled and so on. So I could see it was really very difficult time for the campus. So I kind of went out on a limb and I did issue a statement. And I tried to issue it as sort of neutrally as I could, but I couldn't. I didn't feel that I could shy away from the fact that those were horrendous attacks. Then and they were at least in almost everyone's view just not warranted. I would say there are
Yep.
those who would say otherwise, but it was very complicated, and so. Uh, I kind of wondered if that was the right thing to do. I think some of my team said, this is your call, but think about it. But what happened was I did have then engagement from predominantly, I would say, the Jewish community on campus and the Muslim community on campus separately. And what that did create then, neither one of them was happy with what I had said. I would say in large part. So, but I invited them for real dialogue. So I had people come to my office, and then I had them come to my home separately, and we had real dialogue. I had made sure everybody felt that they were heard, and I felt like it deepened our relationships in ways that wouldn't have come out otherwise. And so then when many campuses across the country were experiencing very serious turmoil, and in some cases quite violent protests and so on, ours didn't. And I had some calls from both of those organizations that said, we're going to work very hard with our communities to try to keep this tamped down. So I would just say, I don't know exactly why we didn't have those such events here, but I feel like that probably contributed to it. So I think it is worthwhile if you can make sure if you can use that a statement as a tool to reach out to your own communities, to reach out not just to for gratuitously comment on something that happened somewhere far away, but it's really important locally, that it's a good reason to actually speak out when normally you wouldn't do so. So that's one example where I decided to go ahead and try to do it, and I think it's had some impact here.
One of the famous lines from the Calvin Report, which, if this isn't the exact line, it's pretty close, is the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic.
Right.
And the idea of that being that it's not that universities are not places to discuss controversial and topical political and social issues. Absolutely, they are the places to have those discussions. And it's the institution's job rather than to shut down the discussion by saying, here's how you have to think about it. And certainly, as you pointed out in the Israel Palestine situation, there's ways to make statements that invite that discussion as opposed to shutting it down. Uh, but the university's job is to facilitate the discussion, to bring the groups together, so that you have respectful dialogue and not, unrest. One of the favorite conversations I've seen here at UW so far was a Bridge UIO event, which was a discussion, dialogue, debate between the head of the College Democrats, who's a trans woman, and the head of Turning Point USA. And they started the discussion by talking about how they were friends and they had become friends working together on free expression in the student government. And I just thought, wow, like what campus would that conversation happen?
Yeah, that's a heartwarming story. I've heard it, and I'm kind of proud that we at least try to create the conditions here where those kinds of things can happen.
So let's dig into that a little bit. How does your administration and how is our campus doing that? What do you think are key elements of an approach to facilitating those conversations that other campuses could replicate?
Well, we're even in during what we call Saddle Up now. It's a new program that we've had in the last couple of years, where we have a kind of a boot camp for how to go to the college, or at least to the University of Wyoming, and it's a week in advance of people actually enrolling in starting classes. They enroll before, of course, they start a little bit before, so they come here, and we do have some presentations on freedom of expression on campus. We've even created a video. So I don't know if you could provide a link to it, Matt, but it's one that kind of talks about how the university operates with freedom of expression and
We
respect.
will, yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. And so we're trying to do that. We're also working with our faculty to sort of lay out some guidelines. What are the do's and don'ts of respectful discourse in the classroom, and so it's always complicated. It's not like there's a simple answer to this, and but we're just grappling with it as honestly and straightforwardly as we can. We're going to be working hard to bring in speakers from all different kinds of points of view and make sure that they're heard, that is the forum for freedom of expression and so on. And there's a book that informs my thinking on a lot of this. It's called Freedom of Expression on Campus, and I'm sure you've read it, Matt, but maybe not everyone out there has seen it, by Erwin Chemerinsky and Howard Gilman, who are leading scholars in this. And I think Chemerinsky is the dean of law school at Berkeley, and
That's right. Yep.
and Gilman's a chancellor in the University of California system. Um, and it's a very, very eye-opening book about, and it's very interesting. It starts off with a series of things that happened on university campuses, and what the reaction was from the administration at the time. And it's sort of each one of the incidents kind of sounds like the campus might have taken a reasonable approach, but in the end they sort of show that basically all of them were wrong.
Right.
Because it requires deeper analysis, and sometimes there's not time to actually think it all through because something is happening. And then it goes into pointing out, like, what are the kind of principles and guidelines for how you should look at any sort of an issue that comes up. It also points out how one court rules in a certain way and then another court overturns that, and so it's not even clear to the judges in the legal profession. So there's a lot of gray area, but it does lay out ways to look at every problem that might come up. So I work with my cabinet now regularly on how we should be looking at this. Our general counsel is an expert in this. Whenever something comes up, nobody goes off in the knee-jerk reaction. We try to think it through from the point of view of what is the First Amendment allow and what does it not allow. And there are things that are not allowed under the First Amendment. There are a number of categories of speech that are not protected speech. And so we try to then really look at it. But we have the framework, and I think we can make much better decisions now on how we do it as we operationalize things across the campus.
Yeah, I've always found one of the most powerful motivations for free speech, besides the John Stuart Mill one about how it makes you smarter. You're not going to understand your own argument unless you understand the other argument, is just the idea that it doesn't make sense to shut down speech and think that you're doing it on behalf of the downtrodden, because by definition, the downtrodden are not the people with power to shut down speech.
Right.
uh, and so it tends to backfire. And kind of a related thing, one of the things that I think is really helpful to the University of Wyoming in having a really positive culture around these issues is that it's not just that we have more political diversity, I think, among our students and faculty and staff than most other universities I've been to. It's also that nobody thinks they're in charge, right? We have academia certainly on average, as a matter of statistics, leans a particular way. I think the people of our state on average lean the other way. And there's kind of a balance there where sort of nobody feels, there's no faction that sort of feels so entitled to power that they don't think they need to talk to the other side, which I think naturally facilitates dialogue. I want to talk about one specific controversial issue that's come up a lot in the public discussion, and is coming up a lot again in the news related to some of the executive orders in the new administration, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. It's another issue where I've personally noticed that UW has taken a fairly unique and nuanced approach. In the following way, as I understand it, one of the things I study political polarization as part of my research, and one of the things that I think is the most, important and underappreciated fact is that we're less polarized than we think. So there's certainly, genuine, deep disagreements in our country, but there's also a lot of talking past each other about different priorities. So, and I think DEI is an example of this. So as I understand it, proponents of DEI want to ensure that campuses are welcoming to students, staff, and faculty from all backgrounds, and they want campuses to be supportive of different needs that people from different backgrounds might have. The way I've just stated it, that's an enormously popular position among the public. Critics of DEI, on the other hand, point out that in practice, DEI efforts on campuses across America have sometimes led to crude race and gender stereotyping, demonization, and discrimination in ways that are illegal in hiring and admissions. And my former institution has unfortunately been in the news for this in the last week. And again, my read of the polls is that Americans agree that that's been happening in some instances and don't like it.
Mhm.
But what strikes me about this is that these aren't mutually exclusive opinions. And there are lots of ways that a university can pursue goals of access and meeting the needs of people from different backgrounds while also not discriminating, stereotyping, or shutting down scientific and scholarly public and political discussion of important issues. So what's been your administration's approach to balancing these areas? Because my impression is that you've done as well or better than just about every school I've seen at kind of recognizing both of those perspectives.
Well, thanks. I mean, I appreciate that. I will say it's a very tricky issue. It's been uh, across the nation. There was an anti-DEI tidal wave that I would say crested about a little more than a year ago, or a couple years ago, or something like that. And I've thought about this a lot as the university president, but also just as a member of university communities for years. And I think the goal, at least as I always interpreted it, was not one to promote a group over another because of some background that they might have, but to ensure that we do have access. We're a land grant university, and access is one of the most important things that we have, and that we are able to support different communities in different ways because they will have different needs. And I'll point out a couple of examples. We have programs here, and these are ones that we continue to have, and they're legally on firm ground to support veterans of wars, in fact. And so at the university, we have programs. We have an office that really helps support them, and they have certain cultural identity and as having been vets and so on, and there may be things that they particularly need. Another one is Native American students. Again, this still passes muster these days, and so we do what we can to bring in students from the reservation. They have very cultural challenges, let's say, as they come from the reservation to a university campus where there aren't very many Native American students, and there are a lot of different expectations and so on. They're far from home. So those are just two examples. And so, in order to deal with that on a broader basis, and maybe what comes to the heart of this is a definition of the word diversity. I've always thought about diversity as crossing every axis, like intellectual diversity, geographical diversity, ethnic diversity, and so on. And if you have people have those a diverse set of backgrounds, then they bring different expectations and ways of looking at things. You bring them together in an appropriate way on a campus, and out comes innovation, and it makes the culture of the campus very rich in the community, and new solutions come up to problems and so on. So that's the way I've kind of always framed it. So that's just the kind of the backdrop. So when I got here, there was an office of diversity, equity, and inclusion already. I didn't create it, but it was a common practice across the country. And the person leading it at the time left. And I thought at the time that it would be good to raise that to the level of a vice president, because we want to make sure that we have the right kind of support structures for all groups here to be successful at the university, and that's the way that's done. But never thought about abandoning merit as the primary criterion for how you succeed here. But there may be things that help you that are better for one community than for another. So anyway, so we did create that. We brought in a terrific leader, actually, Zebediah Hall, and many on the campus will know Zebediah, and he had a great approach, and he had a different approach from what was going on, I'd say, at the national scene. And Zebediah and I talked a lot about this. We wanted to make sure it's not a political agenda. So for us, it was never, for me in the administration, it was never a political agenda. There may be people on campus who thought of it in a political way, but I didn't. And so we had to focus on supporting communities from all walks of life, is the way he looked at it. And he was very successful in having very strongly conservative student groups champion him as a person who was supporting them too. It was not about a political agenda, but we got, I'd say, a bit caught in the crossfire between kind of local and national issues, and the state was responding by saying, we don't think you should be doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we did, and I think this has been difficult for our campus, but we created a group to look at everything we're doing that might be defined as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And by the way, that was never defined either. So we created our own definition, and we tried to put it on the negative side, to say what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. That on the bad side of it is promoting a group, or hiring a group, or giving some group better grades, or in some way advantaging them over another group, that has nothing to do with the merit of what they're doing. And so we say we're not going to do that. And we don't do that. And so, but we said, but let's look ourselves in the mirror and take a very comprehensive look at every program in the university, whether it's in administration or if it's in a college of one kind or another, and see what's happening and see what the language is that's on their websites and so on. So we created a group. It was emotional, I got to say, as some people felt under attack, but it was never like that. And we took inventory, and we created some principles, and we said, okay, here's how we're going to operate going forward. And we worked very, very hard to say this is a merit-based institution, and if we see issues where people are being advantaged in some way because of their background, that or disadvantaged, then we will try to say that is not the way we should be operating, and see what we can do to remedy the situation, but only in a merit-based way. So I think we so the first thing we did was we stopped the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And then but I will say that it did have some things in it that were not just trying to support communities, but it handled some things around federal law, making sure that we implemented things that are still federal law, going back to the Civil Rights Acts and so on, from Title IX and so on, from
Sure.
1972, and so that's still federal law. So we have to make sure that we conform to law. At the same time, we want to make sure that we're clean about how we operate as an institution. And so the group came up with a long set of things that needed to be worked through, and we now have a working group that is continuing to look at every aspect of this to make sure that we're operating around supporting communities. We're not advantaging one group over another. We're not hiring on the basis of diversity, but we're respecting diversity on the campus and diverse points of view. And there were a lot of people that felt very much like they'd been abandoned, I think, in the initial parts of this, but we're take the long game here. So we're working with all of them. I think we're kind of rallying behind in terms of just the people get caught up in the political winds and so on, and they get worried about what does this mean for my community or for another one. But I think we're bringing them along. So at least it's my sense that we're doing pretty well at implementing it, and I hope that we actually are a model for others to be looking at, and how we're actually operationalizing it. But we don't use the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are using access and engagement, and I think that I hope people will understand that that's actually, I think, in the spirit of what a land grant is. We want to engage our communities, and we want everyone to have access and to feel welcome and to be able to succeed here. And that's the way we're operating here.
So as you've been talking about this, advancing your approach, talking to stakeholders on campus, some of whom maybe are on one side of the issue, talking to, stakeholders off campus, some of whom maybe are on the other side of the issue. Do you see any kind of breaking down of the talking past each other I was talking about, in the sense that, do you see maybe, folks who didn't want DEI to go away, recognizing that, what, on some universities, there really was some pretty blatant illegal discrimination going on. And then on the other side, are you seeing people recognizing that, what, there are, real needs of, for example, our indigenous students at UW, that we can serve in a way that doesn't, stereotype or, um, morally privilege one group over another?
Yes, I. I think it's been a very healthy exercise that we're still going through right now. And I would say I've had people from kind of conservative bent saying, thank you for really taking this on. I didn't like what DEI really meant to me, at least, or and the way I was seeing it. And so there were some people I think that did feel that perhaps that they weren't comfortable on this campus speaking out about that. But I want them to. Of course, I really want them to feel like that. So I think they've been empowered. And I think some people that are more on the DEI side have felt worried about what does it mean for our communities. But I think we're doing it in a way that's opening everybody's eyes and seeing, okay, we should be merit focused. I think that makes sense to people, and we should be welcoming, and we need to find a way to kind of to find our way through all of that. And I think that the campus, in large part, is beginning to come along in a way. I think the state is not everyone's seeing it this way, but I hope that they will over time. That we are trying to do what's really good for Wyoming here too, in the way that I think it's important what Wyoming culture is. So it's important to me. We are a land grant institution in the state of Wyoming, and we have to think about how do people look at things here. But it's a state that it values a lot the grit and the kind of the individualism, I would say, that Wyoming is kind of famous for, and we're trying to celebrate that in a way that we can all move forward. And so,
Yeah.
anyway, I think both people on multiple sides of this issue have had their eyes opened, and I think we're in a better place than we were.
Yeah, that's great. Now, let's shift gears a little bit because the political stuff is only one of, three legs of the trust problem that universities nationally are facing. And the other two legs are costs and worries that universities aren't setting up students for the job market. Uh, my impression is that your administration and UW, for a long time, has had both of those things at the front of mind. How do you think about this, and how does your administration trying to address these other two issues, costs and job preparation?
Yeah, these are huge issues that are impacting higher education across the country, and it's been going on. I mean, for a long time, but it's really come to a crescendo in the last decade, I would say. And I've got some statistics that I carry around with me a lot about how people are viewing higher education. Maybe I could start with that because,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, because what you're saying is actually backed up by lots and lots of studies. So about a decade ago, there are some statistics that show that more than 95% of parents, and this is the same on Democrat and Republican side, expected their kids to go to college. That's just about 10 years ago. So that's might be what you would hope for. At least if you're in higher education, you would think that, okay, we have a lot of value and people should be coming to the university. It has plummeted. It is absolutely plummeted now. And so I, I don't have the numbers on how many of the students, how many people expect their kids to go to college, but it's down closer to the 50% range in just a decade. And that's incredible. But then how do young adults look at it? So it turns out that last year, 41% of young adults now say that a college degree is very important, but a decade ago it was 74%. So that's a
Wow,
huge drop
that is.
in what young adults think about whether they should go to college. And so we have to really come to grips with this and understand why this is not about the University of Wyoming. It's a national number, but it's something that we have to grapple with. So I go to the APLU meetings, the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, and I heard a number of people saying, "Yeah, we have to tell our story better." Um, and I say that that's partly true, but we have to do better as well. It's not just telling our story better, but we've got to have a better story to tell. And I think that's what I've been working hard at, both telling the story and having a better story to tell at the university. So the biggest factors in I think this equation that people are thinking why college education is not so valuable anymore, or it's not seen as being so. Well, number one, I think, is costs, and number two, or maybe they're both one, tied for relevance. What's the relevance of my college degree to my career for the job market? And a typical scenario, and that's not one that we want to have very much of, but it's not very uncommon, is a student starts at a university, decides to drop out, has huge debt, can't get a job that took any advantage of the education. The debt is racked up. They might not be able to pay it, and they conclude, and their parents conclude, that it was a terrible waste of time and money, and why did they do that? And so I think this is one of the things that happens. And so there are many things that we're doing here at the University of Wyoming to try to address this. So first of all, we work very hard to keep our costs down. And so we're one of the best values in America for in terms of the cost of attending and the cost of getting a degree. That's important. And then we're also looking at uh, what we can do in terms of making sure that our degrees are valuable and that they prepare students for what they want to do. So but back to the cost. It turns out just in 2019, so it's a little bit old, and we slipped from this, but this is the one in preparing for this. I looked this up. The Wall Street Journal ranked the University of Wyoming as the number two best value among land grant universities. Interesting. MIT was number one. So many people don't realize MIT is a land grant, and they're not a cheap one, but they do
No.
provide a lot of value for their graduates. But that's because they're trained in areas that companies really, really want, and so that helps them.
Right.
But anyway, and University of Wyoming was number five among all institutions, and I think we
Wow.
slipped somewhat, but we're still in the upper echelons of these. So that's very important for us. Now, among our students who graduate, more than half don't have any debt. And that's really something to be proud of. We want to make it
Yeah,
even
that's
clearer.
amazing.
Yeah. And those who do have debt, the average debt, I forgot the number, but my framing for this is it's about the cost of an okay used car. And so,
Yeah.
it,
Order of magnitude less than MIT or
right. It's like in
maybe.
the $20,000 range, which still a lot of
Yeah.
money, but
Yeah.
it's surmountable if you can have a good career that comes out of it. So that's one of the things we do, keep costs down. Second thing we're working very hard on is increasing student success rates. So people who come here, we don't want them to drop out and have some debt or to feel like it was a waste of their time. So we're working very hard every semester by semester, keep more of the students who are here, and then make sure when they graduate, that they've got some connections. We'll maybe get back to that later about connections with industries and so on. But so we have to work harder and harder on that. But another thing we have to do is make sure we have programs at the university that really not only attract the students but to set them up for success. And that means in Wyoming, I want to make sure that the university is really aligned with the Wyoming economy. And you can look at it market sector by market sector. There's energy and extraction. That's number one in terms of the amount of revenue it brings the state. Number two is tourism and hospitality, has the most employees. Number three is agriculture. Not as important, actually, overall to the economy of the state as the first two, but very, very important culturally to the state. So we've got to be able to support those kind of programs. And so there are others, of course. There's business and engineering and so on. So we've got to have programs that support the existing Wyoming economy. Secondly, it's the 21st century, and you can't even go through a half of a day now without seeing some story about computing or AI. And yesterday, I mean, this week, the tech markets lost like hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in value because of a single small company starting up in the tech
Right.
world from China. And so, and President Trump, his second day of being president, announced a $500 billion program in AI. And it's because it's going to impact every single market. Every single job market is going to be absolutely transformed by it. It's not hype. It's just what's really happening. So I want to make sure that every one of our graduates has some sense of digital skills that they'll be able to apply. If they're an English major or a business major or a physics major, they need to have those skills when they go on. Then I want to make sure we have programs to support entrepreneurship. Not everybody will be an entrepreneur, but an English major or a physics major, again, an engineering major, just like a business major, can have those skills, and we can then create more opportunities to start up companies in this state. So I want to make sure that we have those kinds of things that we offer. So it's programmatic offerings as well as the student success and the cost and the raising money for scholarships and so on. So part of this, what I'm getting at, is experiential learning. Want to make sure every student has an opportunity to get their hands on in some project that's related to the discipline that they're trying to study, that will give them a sense of what is it, how, and that will increase their success rates as well as make sure that they've got the skills to go like classroom to career, not just to a job. So these are really important. And I have some statistics I'm going to tell you about here in a
Yeah,
second.
good.
Okay. So, um, internships are really an important part of this, and I'm going to focus a lot going forward on how can we provide internships for our students with companies in the direction that they want to go in terms of their careers. So there's a study by an organization called Strata, and Strata, and I learned this last summer. It just really opened my eyes. So everybody should hear this. There's a thing called underemployment. So you graduate from college, but you get a job as a barista or something like
Right.
that, and you don't really go into your career. And it turns out 52% of college graduates across the country are getting jobs that don't require their college degree. So they're underemployed, and that's not a good outcome.
No, it's
Right.
not, and it's been true for a long time. I
Right.
mean, I
Exactly.
graduated from college 15 years ago about, and it certainly was an issue among my peers back
Right.
then.
So it turns out there's one intervention you can take that has a large impact on this. And is if you have, and the study shows, if you have a single paid internship with a company during your undergraduate time, so that's not like, doesn't mean every year, just you did it once, you have a 50% greater likelihood of getting a job in your chosen field with a career path, as opposed to just getting a job. So this is more like supporting people for careers. There's another study by an organization called Burning Glass that shows that internships increase the likelihood that you graduate, and that's important, by 170%. So it's enormously larger because
Wow.
the student gets a much better idea. Why am I taking this class? Oh my goodness, it actually matters in the in this company that I just worked for. I had no idea it was really that important. So they get the sense of where the pathway can go, and they want to stick it out and get it. So the recommendation that comes out of this is that universities should try to provide opportunities for as many students as possible to have paid internships. And so I'm working hard with our team and with the Wyoming Business Alliance and with others in the state to try to assess how far are we from being able to promise this? What do we have to put in place to make sure that it's possible? And can we get some support from the business community to do it? And they're all interested in making it happen. We just have to figure out how do we organize and operationalize this, and we're on it right now. I don't want to promise it. I don't want to say every student here can at least be promised an opportunity if they want it to have an internship, but I want to try to get there. So I want to be able to see if we can have enough machinery in place and enough support to actually make that happen. I think that will make the university extremely attractive. I think students will graduate in much higher rates. And I think that many of them will have be able to find employment in the state of Wyoming, and that's going to be good for everybody. So it's a virtuous cycle there. It'll feed back on itself, and I'm looking forward to trying to implement this.
Right, and as the only 4-year college, in a fairly small population state with a very strong business community, if anybody can do it, it's us, right?
Hmm. Right, I think that's right.
So we don't have much time left. I want to end with two bigger picture open-ended questions. The first, which is inspired by the question that Konstantin Kisin, who's a podcaster that I follow, always ends his podcast with, and that is, what do you think is the most important challenge or opportunity facing colleges in the 21st century that we're not currently talking enough about?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and maybe I can list a few things that we did just talk about, including what's the value proposition for the university? Because clearly, this is a big one. What's the public think about the university or and the universities across the country? But in my case, Wyoming. What about student success? What can we do to make sure students do graduate and go on to careers? What about experiential learning? The points about institutional neutrality and so on. So these are things that we're really focused on. Um, but just recall when I came here, I talked about earlier in this podcast these three kind of bigger challenges. I think that are like the profound transformation of not just science but society now as a result of the digital revolution. I really don't think people on average are thinking about this deeply enough. It's not a fad. It's really going to change things. So it could be within 5 years. In fact, there are studies by McKinsey and others that look at market by market how are jobs going to be transformed. It's going to be so different particularly because of AI, but not only because of AI. So we have to be on the move ourselves as institutions that are preparing students for this. So kids that are just graduating from or entering high school now, let's put it that way, when they graduate from college, and that's going out 8 to 10 years, the world's going to look really different. So we've got to make sure we're really prepared for that. And so that's one piece. The second piece is many of the challenges that we have as a society do require the integration of many different aspects of things: social science, business, could be technology, literature, because you have a good sense of the human condition, history. You've seen this, you've been there, you've done that, so don't repeat those mistakes. All of that, you need to have all of these kinds of things, and the university is one of the only places that has all of that. And so how do we effectively harness that to really address real problems in society? That's very important, I think, for me. And then the third one is, how do you take all of this and make sure that the university, any university, but ours in particular, has it really help drive the economy? And in the state of Wyoming, the economy is very much focused on really one market sector and a couple of others, but and so we have these boom bust cycles, and it's going to be changing. So how do we help diversify and grow the economy while also preparing our students for existing economies? We have to take all those things. So those are the big kind of picture things. I started with that, and I just want to raise those at the end as key issues, big issues for universities to grapple with.
Yeah, one thread that kind of connects all three, I think, is this idea of AI and its energy efficiency.
Hmm.
That, as I understand it, is one of the biggest innovations of this DeepSeek company that's upended the industry.
That's right.
Uh, and it really reminds me of a conversation I had with an AI podcaster from the UK a few months ago, where he said, the human brain operates on the power of a light bulb.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and so there's just this enormous potential if you think about productivity, not just from the intelligence from AI, but also just the amazing deltas that are possible in efficiency. And well, that's a thread that combines biology, right, with computing and other areas. Uh, and just this week, Olivier Blanchard, who used to be the head economist of the IMF, said that he thought this might be the biggest total factor productivity shock in the history of humanity. I'm maybe a little bit less optimistic and think it remains to be seen. But this is the kind of revolution that we're looking at, and so it's
It's
good that we're thinking about how to get ahead of it.
I truly think it's one of the more important developments in human history. And so, I mean, maybe that'll sound like hype in 15 years from now, but I don't really think so. I think it is really one of those moments. It's going to be big.
Certainly has the potential to be. Okay, my last question is that my sense, particularly over the last 10 years,
Oh, hey, Matt,
is that,
there's I forgot. There's a
oh
thing.
sure,
There's a book called "The Singularity Is Near," by
I've
Ray
heard of it.
Kurzweil. Yeah, and he's a sort of a luminary, of an MIT grad, won the President's Medal of Science, or all these kind of things. Just really been a transformative figure, and he was basically trying to calculate in part. Where machine intelligence will exceed human intelligence, and he actually knows all these technology curves. And kind of your comment about the human brain working well, I would say a jelly donut, but anyway, the energy in a jelly donut, but
Yeah,
energy of a light bulb. So he looks at all kinds of technology curves and looks how industry by industry how it will be transformed. And in the sequel to that book, the Singularity is Near. It's called The Singularity is Nearer. So it's closer. And that's a book that came out last summer. And so, and people in the audience who are interested in this stuff, I'd encourage them to look at it.
and just a related plug, had the pleasure of meeting Amory Lovins last summer, who's written some amazingly prescient and innovative things about energy efficiency and how there's all kinds of um, untapped but incredibly vast energy efficiency improvements. One of them is making code more efficient. The more we digitize, we become. But he's just really fascinating guy, and I encourage our listeners to read his stuff. He has a house in the mountains in Colorado that doesn't have an HVAC system and is able to be acclimatized
Hmm.
because it's so well designed. So my last question is the following. My sense over the last 10 years is that people expect more and more from university presidents. right? You're the executive, you're a fundraiser. Some people expect you to be their therapist. They expect you to be a statesperson who's knowledgeable in all things current events, foreign affairs specialist, right? In some places, um, of course, that's totally unrealistic. So, what I would love to hear from you is, what do you think are a university president's most important levers of influence for improving a university and advancing its mission?
Yeah, it's something I've certainly grappled with, as has probably every university president, especially these days, as there is so much more expected of all of us, and you can see it in the average tenure of a president is going down over time because the
Right.
demands are really quite high, and it's far more kind of caught in political winds and so on than it probably used to be, and things move very fast as well. We were just talking about all the
And
facts.
the left tail risk, right? How many presidents do you know that are famous for doing something good, right? It's a short list. Whereas,
Oh,
how many presidents are famous for, crashing and burning? It's a much
oh, I know.
longer list.
Yeah, and it's surprising how small in quotes an incident can be that can unseat a president these days, because we
Yeah.
just don't realize sometimes something that looks small, but it's going to be huge, and you just didn't quite catch it. So anyway, there are two pieces to this that I have, and I did a lot of reading on university presidents and what they thought about their jobs before coming in here, and I kind of always come back to it. There's a set of kind of guide stars you can help set about what it is you're trying to do. So we have things now. We have student success, and I had my pillars about complex problems and technology and so on. I interdisciplinarity, but those were some. But in any case, you can't just dictate them. You have to work with your team to come up with what are key institutional priorities, and it does come down to a strategic plan, but one that should talk about what are the values of the institution and what are you really aiming for? What are you really, really aiming for? And how do you operationalize it? And then you've got to find ways to rally your team. And it just takes a lot of effort. So I spend as much of my time trying to make sure my team is able to move forward and stay on track on things and maybe readjust if something happens, and we have to be nimble, but to be able to do that, and it requires that kind of time, but it's largely about making sure that people are, to the extent possible, on a university campus that values freedom of expression and all different ideas and so on. We're actually also moving to support certain goals, and we've got to then make sure we're all behind it. And so a lot of my job is kind of cheerleader for the goals, and trying to help where I can to kind of inspire or cajole or help us kind of drive in the same direction. And so I spend a lot of my time talking to people, just having meetings, talking to people, but I'm also tracking to see are we on track and so on, and constantly looking at. I'm going to have some meetings with my some members, number of members of my cabinet, where we're going to again take a hard look. Okay, are we on track? What do we need to do differently? Do we need to put some things that weren't working and put them on the back burner or stop them altogether? Constantly be looking at that, always trying to make yourself better. I mean, maybe that's another way to look at it, but making sure the team feels that they're valued and they're trusted to carry out their work. And so I would say that's the president's top job, helping to set those goals, get everybody as much as you can behind them, and then look and see are they working.
Well, President Ed Seidel, thanks for spending the time and lifting the veil on what it's like to be a college president in 2025. Appreciate the work that you're doing on all of these issues, but particularly free expression and constructive dialogue, which are issues that are close to my heart. And thanks for coming on the Grounded Not Divided podcast.
Thanks, I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.